Picture a small stone house outside Florence. The year is 1513. A man who spent 14 years serving the republic he loved has just been tortured, imprisoned, and released by the very city he gave everything to protect. Each morning he wakes before dawn and puts on his worst clothes. He walks into the fields, argues with woodcutters about timber prices, plays cards with labourers at the local inn, drinks rough wine, and listens to gossip about people he does not care about. Then evening comes. He goes back to the house. He takes off the dirty clothes. He puts on his finest robes. He sits down at his desk, and for a few hours each night he enters what he calls the courts of ancient men, where he is received kindly, and where he feeds on the food that alone is his, and for which he was born. He is writing a small book. It will not restore his income, or repair his reputation, or get him the job he desperately wants. But 500 years from now, that book will still be in print in every major language on earth, read by presidents and generals and students and prisoners and philosophers. His name is Niccolò Machiavelli, and much of what the modern world thinks it knows about him is wrong. Settle in. Let the noise of the present fade. The desk is waiting. Chapter 1. The City That Made Him. There is a thing that happens to people who grow up inside a beautiful system that is quietly rotting. They learn to read surfaces differently from everyone else. They learn that the gap between how things appear and how things work is not an accident or a failure. It is the system, and that knowledge, absorbed early enough, does not make a person cynical. It makes them precise. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence on the 3rd of May, 1469. He was the third child of Bernardo Machiavelli, a lawyer of modest income and immodest intellectual appetite, and Bartolommea de Nelli, who wrote devotional poetry in her spare hours. The family was not poor. They owned a small house in the city and a farm in the countryside of Sant'Andrea in Percasina, the same place where Machiavelli would one day sit at that famous desk and write. But they were not wealthy either. Bernardo spent decades managing a debt that never quite disappeared, keeping careful accounts in a journal that survives to this day, and that historians have studied closely because it tells us something important about the household Niccolò grew up in. It was a household organized around books. Bernardo Machiavelli could not always afford to buy the books he wanted. So he made arrangements. He negotiated with a printer named Francesco di Dino to index a copy of Livy's History of Rome in exchange for receiving a copy for himself. He borrowed texts and copied them by hand. He kept a record of every book that passed through his house, and his son, from a very early age. Read all of them. This matters more than it might seem. Florence, in the 1470s, had schools, and Niccolò attended them and received the standard humanist education of his class. Latin grammar, rhetoric, basic arithmetic. But the real education was happening at home, in the evenings, in a household where a financially stretched lawyer treated access to Livy and Cicero and the ancient historians as a necessity rather than a luxury. The boy who would later fill the pages of the discourses on Livy with close readings of Roman Republican history learned to read Livy before he understood what a republic was. But books were only half of the education Florence was providing. The other half arrived on the 26th of April, 1478. in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, during High Mass, in front of hundreds of worshippers. Niccolò was 8 years old, almost 9. The Pazzi family, the great banking rivals of the Medici, had decided that the most efficient way to solve their political problem was the oldest way. They recruited Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa, and a soldier named Bernardo Bandini. The plan was to kill both Lorenzo de' Medici and his younger brother Giuliano at the same moment, during the elevation of the host, when every head in the cathedral would be bowed. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed 19 times. He died on the cathedral floor. Lorenzo was wounded in the neck, but escaped into the sacristy, where his friends barricaded the bronze doors. He survived. What followed was not the restoration of order. It was the demonstration of what power looks like when it is threatened and responds without restraint. Lorenzo de' Medici moved through Florence in the days after the conspiracy, with a systematic efficiency that the Pazzi family had not anticipated. Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop, was hanged from a window of the Palazzo della Signoria in his ecclesiastical robes. Jacopo de' Pazzi, the head of the family, was killed, buried, dug up because people believed his corpse was causing bad weather, dragged through the streets by children, and thrown into the Arno. Dozens of men connected to the conspiracy were executed, imprisoned, or exiled. Botticelli was commissioned to paint the images of the hanged conspirators on the outer walls of the Palazzo della Signoria itself, a public gallery of the condemned, visible to anyone who walked through the heart of the city. The city that Machiavelli was growing up in did not hide this. It displayed it. A child growing up in Florence in 1478 did not read about political violence in books. He walked past its painted portraits on public walls. He heard the stories retold in the streets. He understood, at the age when understanding is most permanent, that the beautiful city with its domes and its paintings and its learned men and its elegant Latin was also a place where archbishops were hanged from windows and bodies were thrown into rivers. This is the first and most important thing to understand about Machiavelli. He did not arrive at his understanding of power through cynicism or through a cold and calculated decision to reject morality. He arrived at it through the specific education that Florence provided to every child who was paying attention. The gap between the ideal and the real was not a philosophical problem in Florence. It was the weather. Lorenzo de' Medici, the man who ordered those executions, was also the man who commissioned some of the greatest art in human history, who kept Botticelli and Leonardo and Michelangelo employed, who wrote poetry of genuine quality, who presided over a court that the rest of Europe looked at with a mixture of admiration and envy. He was called Lorenzo the Magnificent, and the name was not ironic. He was magnificent. He was also ruthless, in a way that the magnificence did not soften or contradict. It was the same man doing both things. Machiavelli watched this for the first 20 years of his life, and filed it away with the precision of someone who does not yet know what he is filing it for, but understands instinctively that it matters. He watched Florence under Lorenzo and understood it as a system in equilibrium, tense and brilliant, and dependent on the particular genius of one man to hold it together. He watched the relationship between the Medici and the people of Florence, which was not the relationship of a tyrant and his subjects. Exactly. But was not the relationship of a free republic either. Lorenzo held no official title that gave him the right to govern. He governed anyway, through money and patronage and reputation, and the carefully managed consent of the people who mattered. He was, in a word that Machiavelli would later spend an entire book trying to define and analyze, un prince, not by law, but by the specific combination of ability and circumstance that Machiavelli would call virtue. And then, in 1492, Lorenzo died. He was 43 years old. He left behind a city that had been organized around his particular ability to hold contradictions in balance, and a son named Piero, who had inherited the position without anything close to the qualities required to maintain it. Machiavelli was 23 years old. He had no government position yet. He was still on the outside of power, watching, but he was watching with the trained attention of a man who had been absorbing the mechanics of Florentine politics his entire life. And what he saw in the years after Lorenzo's death was the clearest possible illustration of a lesson he would later write down and try to teach to anyone who would listen. Systems do not run themselves. Institutions, without the right people inside them, are shells. And when the person who has been holding a fragile equilibrium together disappears, what comes next is not a smooth transition. What comes next is the thing that was being held back. In Florence, the thing being held back arrived 2 years later, in the form of a French army. In 1494, King Charles VIII of France crossed the Alps with an army that contemporaries described with stunned disbelief. Tens of thousands of soldiers, artillery that could reduce walls that had stood for centuries, a military force of a scale that the Italian city-states had no real answer to. Piero de' Medici, faced with this army, made the decision that sealed his fate. He rode out to meet Charles and surrendered Florence's key fortresses before the French had even demanded them. Florence erupted. Piero de' Medici was driven from the city within days. The Medici palaces were sacked. The family that had defined Florentine politics for 60 years was gone, suddenly and completely, and in their place was something that had not existed in Florence for a generation. A republic, a real one, or something attempting to be real, with a great council of more than 3,000 citizens, and genuine elections, and the genuine uncertainty about outcomes that elections produce. Machiavelli was 25 years old. He had grown up inside a system built around one family's dominance and watched it collapse in a matter of weeks. He had seen what happened when the person holding the center together was gone. He had seen how quickly a population that had seemed loyal and stable could turn. He had seen what French artillery did to Italian political assumptions. And into this suddenly open and uncertain, Florence walked a Dominican friar from Ferrara named Girolamo Savonarola, who was about to give Machiavelli the most important single lesson of his political education. Savonarola had been preaching in Florence since 1490, and his sermons had been building in intensity and in audience for years. He preached repentance. He preached that Florence's beauty and wealth were sins, that the art and the luxury and the philosophical learning of the Medici court were corruption dressed in elegance. He preached that God was angry and that the French army was the proof, the scourge sent to punish a city that had forgotten what mattered. Florence listened. This is the part that always surprises people who encounter it for the first time. Florence, the city of Botticelli and Leonardo, the city that had produced the most sophisticated visual, and intellectual culture in Europe. Followed a friar who told them to burn their books and their mirrors and their fine clothes. Bonfires of the vanities were not metaphors. They were actual fires. In the actual Piazza della Signoria, into which Florentines threw paintings and manuscripts and carnival masks, while Savonarola's followers watched to make sure the burning was thorough. Machiavelli watched this too. He did not join the bonfires. He did not become one of Savonarola's followers, but he watched with the careful attention of a man who is storing something he will need later, and what he saw taught him something that no book had prepared him for. He saw that people do not primarily make political decisions based on rational calculation of their interests. They make them based on what they feel, what they fear, what they believe the universe is telling them. Savonarola offered Florence a story about its situation, a story in which the suffering had meaning and the path forward was clear. And Florence took the story, because stories are what frightened people reach for first. He also saw what happened when the story stopped working. Savonarola's power depended on his ability to convince people that he had a direct line to God's intentions, and that line required results. When he predicted that the French would be driven from Italy and they were not, when Pope Alexander VI excommunicated him and demanded that Florence surrender him, the story began to crack. The end came in the spring of 1498. Savonarola was challenged to prove his divine connection through an ordeal by fire. He declined. The crowd that had followed him for years turned on him with the speed that crowds always turn when the thing they believed in fails. He was arrested, and on the 23rd of May, 1498, hanged and burned in the Piazza della Signoria, the same square where his followers had burned the vanities. Machiavelli was 28 years old. 3 weeks after Savonarola's execution, he received his first government appointment. He was hired as the second Chancellor of the Florentine Republic, a position that would give him access to the inner workings of power for the next 14 years. He would spend those 14 years watching everything, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to write down what he had seen. The lesson Savonarola left behind was one Machiavelli would return to repeatedly in his writing. An unarmed prophet always fails, not because his message is wrong or his conviction is false, but because conviction without the capacity to compel is always at the mercy of the moment. The conviction wavers. The crowd that cheers you today will light the fire tomorrow, and the man who understands this is not a cynic. He is simply someone who watched it happen in a public square and did not look away. And here, at the beginning of this story, is the question that will follow us through every chapter that comes. It is the question that Machiavelli spent his entire life circling, the question that his books raise, without ever fully answering, the question that is still alive today in every room where power is exercised, and every institution that claims to serve the people it governs. Can a man who loved his city honestly, who served it faithfully, who saw it clearly, be the person history remembers as a villain? Or did we misread him for 500 years? Because the truth he was telling was the one we least wanted to hear. Keep that question close. We are going to need it. Chapter 2. The Diplomat and the Education of a Realist. The road from Florence to Forli in the autumn of 1499 was 3 days of travel through the hills of Romagna. The kind of journey that gave a man time to think if the mule was cooperative, and time to curse if it was not. Machiavelli was 30 years old, recently appointed to the Chancery, and on his way to negotiate with one of the most formidable rulers in Italy. He was not yet the man who would write The Prince. He was still becoming him, and the becoming was happening on roads like this one, in rooms like the ones waiting for him at the end of it, across tables from people who would teach him through their conduct and their calculations and their silences, the things that no book in his father's library had been able to teach. There is a difference between a person who understands power from reading about it and a person who understands power from sitting across a table from it. The first kind of understanding produces theories. The second kind produces something harder to name, a quality of attention, a specific and earned wariness, the ability to watch a man smile and know exactly what the smile is concealing. Machiavelli spent 14 years acquiring the second kind of understanding, and the education did not come from a single dramatic encounter or a single revelatory moment. It came from accumulation, from sitting in rooms with powerful people year after year and watching the gap between what they said and what they did and what they needed, until the gap itself became the most reliable thing he knew about political life. The position of Second Chancellor was not a glamorous one. It carried real responsibility but limited prestige. Machiavelli was not a senator or a member of the councils that made the great decisions. He was the man who drafted the letters, managed the correspondence, recorded the deliberations, and carried out the practical work that kept the Republic's machinery turning. He was, in the language of a later century, a senior civil servant, educated, capable, trusted with information, but not trusted with power. This turned out to be exactly the right position for learning what he needed to learn, because the person who drafts the letters sees everything. He sees the decision that was made in the council chamber, and he sees the letter that goes out describing a different decision. He sees the instruction given to the ambassador, and he sees the private note that contradicts it. He sees the public face of the Republic, and he sees the face behind it. And over years of seeing both, he develops an understanding of the gap between them that no amount of philosophical reading could have produced. His first significant test came at the end of that road in Forli, when he arrived at the court of Caterina Sforza. Caterina Sforza was one of the most remarkable rulers in Renaissance Italy, a woman who had governed her small state through a combination of intelligence and a refusal to behave as anyone expected a woman in her position to behave. Stories about her circulated throughout Italy, some verified by contemporaries, others almost certainly embellished in the retelling over years, but all of them pointing toward the same quality: a person who understood that reputation was a weapon, and that the maintenance of it required a specific kind of performance that had nothing to do with sentiment. The room where they met was not large. The fire burned well against the October cold. Caterina Sforza sat at the centre of it, with the particular stillness of someone who has nothing to prove to the man across the table and knows it. Machiavelli had prepared his arguments carefully. He had the terms Florence was offering. He had the diplomatic language that was supposed to make those terms sound more generous than they were. He deployed it all. She listened. She was polite. She gave him every courtesy. And she sent him home with nothing. He was not angry about this. He was fascinated. What he wrote in his reports back to Florence reveals something important about how his mind was already working. He did not describe her as difficult or unreasonable. He described her as someone who understood exactly what she needed and had no intention of accepting less. She had made a calculation based on her actual situation, and the calculation had led her to a conclusion that happened to be inconvenient for Florence. This was not a moral failure. It was competence. The lesson was simple and would prove durable across every subsequent encounter of his career. People with real power make decisions based on real interests. Eloquence can influence those decisions at the margins. It cannot override them. If you want to understand what a powerful person will do, do not listen to what they say. Look at what they need. He carried that lesson to every negotiation that followed, and none of those negotiations would push it further than the months he spent at the court of Cesare Borgia. In the summer of 1502, the Florentine Republic sent Machiavelli to Borgia's court. Cesare Borgia was 26 years old. He was the son of Pope Alexander VI, and he had spent the preceding 3 years converting papal patronage into territory, taking city after city through a combination of military force, strategic deception, and a talent for identifying the exact moment when an enemy's confidence had become overconfidence. He held the title Duke of Valentinois, given to him by the King of France, and was building what looked, from the outside, like the foundation of a unified state in central Italy. Machiavelli spent several months at his court, observing and reporting. The dispatches he sent back to Florence during this period are among the most vivid documents in the archive of Renaissance diplomacy. They describe a man who operated at a speed and with a decisiveness that made the cautious deliberations of the Florentine councils look like a different activity entirely. Borgia did not consult, he decided. He did not explain his reasoning to the people around him. He acted, and the people around him either kept up or found themselves on the wrong side of a situation that had already moved past them. Machiavelli was not naive about what he was looking at. Borgia had people killed. He arranged the elimination of his own captains at Senigallia in January of 1503, luring them to a meeting under the pretense of reconciliation and having them seized when they arrived, using his lieutenant Michelotto Corella to carry out the executions once the trap had closed. Machiavelli was present for the aftermath. He wrote about it in a dispatch that is remarkable for its tone, which is neither approving nor horrified, but analytical. The tone of a man who is watching something carefully because he believes it contains information that matters. What Machiavelli saw at Senigallia was this. Borgia's captains had been conspiring against him. They had met secretly, formed alliances, and believed themselves clever. Borgia had known about the conspiracy, had allowed it to develop, had given the conspirators time to feel secure, and had then eliminated them all at once, rather than picking them off one by one in a way that would have given the survivors time to run. From a purely analytical standpoint, one action had solved a problem that a dozen smaller actions would have prolonged and complicated. This is the moment that many readers of Machiavelli stop and reach for a simple conclusion. He admired Borgia, therefore he approved of what Borgia did, therefore he was without morality. But that conclusion requires ignoring something important. Machiavelli's dispatches about Borgia are not written in the language of admiration. They are written in the language of analysis. He is not saying that what Borgia did was good. He is saying that it worked, and he is trying to understand why. Because understanding why is the only way to understand anything about the world he is living in. He also noticed, with the precision that made him exceptional as an observer, the single flaw in Borgia's construction. Everything Borgia had built depended on his father. The papal armies, the French backing, the political cover that allowed him to take territory without triggering a coalition of enemies, all of it ran through Pope Alexander VI. In August of 1503, Pope Alexander VI died. Borgia was sick himself at the same moment, possibly from the same illness, and unable to act at the exact moment when action was the only thing that could save him. Borgia made one decisive mistake in the chaos that followed. He allowed the election of Giuliano della Rovere as Pope Julius II, a man who had every reason to destroy him and the will to follow through. Machiavelli later wrote that Borgia had told him he had thought of everything that might happen when his father died and had found a remedy for all of it, except that he had not thought he himself would also be close to death at that moment. That single sentence stayed with Machiavelli for the rest of his life. It was the purest possible expression of the problem that no amount of intelligence or preparation could fully solve. You can plan for everything you can imagine. The thing that destroys you is always the thing you could not quite bring yourself to imagine. Real strength beats eloquence, but even real strength has a boundary where fortune begins. The capable leader plans for everything except the things that cannot be planned for, and it is always one of the unplannable things that finishes him. Over the next several years, Machiavelli travelled constantly in the service of the Republic, adding observation after observation to the picture he was building. He went to the French court at Lyons in 1503 and watched the French king make decisions with the casual indifference of a man who did not need to take Italian concerns seriously, because Italian states had nothing. He needed to fear. The court was brilliant and cold in the way that courts are cold when they are large enough that the people in them have stopped needing to pretend to care about those below them. Machiavelli took notes. He always took notes. He went to the court of Emperor Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire in 1507 and spent months observing a ruler whose primary characteristic was an inability to commit to a decision long enough to carry it out. The emperor's reception rooms were hung with tapestries that told the stories of great campaigns. The emperor himself could not finish a single one. He consulted everyone. He was genuinely open to being persuaded by the last person who had spoken to him. He revised his position constantly in light of new arguments. These qualities sound like virtues and function as a catastrophic deficiency in a leader, because they mean that every plan is provisional, every alliance is temporary, and the people who need to execute the decisions never know whether the ground beneath them is stable. Machiavelli wrote a long report about Maximilian for the Florentine government. He does not moralize. He describes, with a precision that feels almost clinical, the mechanism by which a single character defect in a leader produces institutional dysfunction at every level below it. He travelled with Pope Julius II on military campaign in 1506 and watched an elderly man in papal robes lead an army into battle with an energy that embarrassed the secular commanders around him. Julius taught him about audacity, the willingness to move fast and force the situation rather than waiting for conditions to improve. It could accomplish things that careful calculation could not, at least for a while. And the "at least for a while" was the part that Machiavelli always remembered, because Julius's boldness was also, eventually, the thing that stretched his resources past the point they could bear. He was also, during all these years of travel, reading everything he could find about the ancient world. The Roman historians who had filled his father's library were now his primary companions on the long journeys between cities. He read Livy and Tacitus and Polybius, not as a scholar reads them, looking for elegance and accuracy, but as an engineer reads a manual, looking for the principles that explained why some structures held and others collapsed. What he found in the Romans confirmed and deepened what he was finding in his direct experience. The problems were the same. The solutions attempted were the same. The failures occurred for the same reasons. The specific names and places were different. But the underlying mechanics, the way that ambition and fear and fortune and the particular qualities of individual leaders combined to produce the outcomes that history recorded, those were constant. Human nature was not changing. The circumstances changed. The nature stayed. This was not a depressing conclusion. It was a liberating one. If the mechanics were constant, they could be studied. If they could be studied, they could be understood. If they could be understood, it might be possible to act within them with less waste, less unnecessary failure, less of the catastrophic surprise that came from refusing to see things as they were. He was building, without knowing he was building it, the conceptual framework that would eventually become his books. But before he could write those books, the framework needed its most important test, and that test was about to arrive in the form of an idea he believed in completely, an institution he built with everything he had, and a single afternoon that destroyed it all. Chapter 3. The Militia Dream and the Limits of Idealism. A particular kind of mistake belongs only to people with genuine conviction. It is the mistake of believing that because something is true, the world will eventually organize itself around that truth. It is the mistake of the person who has done the analysis correctly, arrived at the right conclusion, and then assumed that the rightness of the conclusion will be sufficient to carry it through the resistance of institutions, habits, and interests that were built around a different conclusion. Machiavelli made this mistake. He made it with his eyes open. He made it with more political sophistication than almost anyone around him, and he made it anyway, because the conviction was genuine and the need was real. And sometimes those two things together are enough to make an intelligent person believe that the obstacles are smaller than they are. The conviction had been forming since his earliest diplomatic missions. It had hardened into certainty during his time at Borgia's court, and it had a specific, concrete shape that made it different from an abstract belief. Machiavelli believed that Florence was going to lose everything it had unless it stopped relying on mercenary soldiers and built an army of its own citizens. The mercenary system in Renaissance Italy had developed over more than a century into something that functioned less like military service and more like a peculiar form of theatre. Not always, and not in every engagement, but often enough that Machiavelli had seen the pattern repeat itself across too many campaigns to dismiss it as coincidence. The condottieri, the captains who led the hired companies, had learned that their commercial interests were best served by battles that looked dangerous but produced as few casualties as possible. Dead soldiers were expensive to replace. Captains who lost too many men lost their bargaining position, and so the battles of the mercenary era tended to be elaborate, time-consuming, and surprisingly inconclusive affairs, in which the appearance of fighting was maintained while both sides worked to avoid the full costs that actual fighting produced. Machiavelli had seen this with his own eyes. He had watched Florentine hired soldiers maneuver for weeks to take positions that a determined force could have taken in days. He had watched battles end in draws when one side had a clear advantage, because the captain on the winning side had calculated that pressing the advantage would cost him more than the additional ground was worth. And he had watched Pisa. Pisa was the wound that would not close. Florence had lost control of it in 1494, when Piero de' Medici surrendered its fortresses to the French, and the city had been asserting its independence ever since. Every year that Pisa remained out of Florentine control was a year of economic damage and political humiliation, and every year the hired soldiers Florence sent to deal with the problem managed to not quite deal with it in ways that were expensive and entirely ineffective. His analysis was consistent and correct. The mercenary system was not just expensive, it was structurally incapable of producing the results Florence needed, because the incentives of the men being paid to fight were not aligned with the interests of the city paying them. A mercenary captain who won quickly and decisively was a mercenary captain who had worked himself out of a contract. A captain who managed the situation carefully to remain necessary was a captain who ate well, slept safely, and retired comfortably. The solution Machiavelli proposed was the one the Romans had used. Citizens, men who fought because they were fighting for their own homes, their own families, their own city. Men whose incentives were perfectly aligned with the outcome because the outcome was their outcome. Men who could not calculate that losing slowly was better for their careers than winning quickly, because their careers were not in soldiering. Their lives were in Florence, and Florence, winning or losing, was their lives, winning or losing. He began pushing this idea in 1503, through reports and memoranda and conversations with the men who had the authority to act on it. The response was not enthusiastic. The Florentine political class had concerns that were not entirely unreasonable. Arming citizens was a step with consequences that were difficult to predict. Armed citizens could be used for purposes other than external defence. The history of Italian city-states contained enough examples of armed factions turning their weapons inward to make the cautious men of the councils genuinely nervous. There were also interests at stake. The mercenary system had beneficiaries beyond the captains themselves. There were Florentine citizens who had relationships with particular condottieri, who profited from the contracts, who had built careers and connections around the existing arrangement. Change is always easiest to support in the abstract and hardest to support when it threatens something comfortable and specific. Machiavelli pushed anyway. He wrote, he argued, he lobbied, he demonstrated, with specific examples drawn from Roman history and from recent Italian experience, that citizen soldiers had consistently outperformed hired ones when the conditions were comparable. He proposed recruiting the militia from the rural countryside around Florence rather than from the city itself, reducing the risk of urban factional violence while maintaining the motivational alignment that made citizens fight differently from hired men. It took 3 years. In 1506, the Florentine Republic authorized the creation of the citizen militia. Machiavelli was appointed as its administrator, responsible for recruitment, organization, training, and deployment. It was the most significant institutional achievement of his career, the moment when the ideas he had been developing from his first diplomatic missions were given a concrete form in the world. He threw himself into it completely. He travelled the countryside around Florence, recruiting men, evaluating candidates, working out the practical details of organizing a force that had no precedent in the recent history of the region. The work was unglamorous, cold in winter and dusty in summer, full of arguments about pay schedules and equipment lists, and the particular stubbornness of rural men who had their own views about what constituted adequate training. He was not a soldier himself, but he had been observing military operations for years with the specific attention of someone always asking why things worked the way they did. And that attention had given him an understanding of military organization that was more sophisticated than that of many men who had spent their careers in the field. The militia began to take shape. The men were farmers and labourers, not trained fighters. Their equipment was basic. Their discipline was inconsistent. But they were there, and they were Florentine, and they were fighting for something that meant something to them in a way that no hired soldier fighting for a monthly payment could replicate. And then, in 1509, they delivered. The siege of Pisa had been going on, in various forms, for 15 years. Florentine hired soldiers had failed to end it in every way imaginable. In the spring of 1509, Machiavelli's militia was part of the force that finally brought the siege to its conclusion. Pisa fell, after 15 years of humiliation and expense. Florence had its city back. It was the high point of Machiavelli's public career. The idea that had taken 3 years to authorize and 3 more years to build had produced the result that the old system had failed to produce for a decade and a half. He had been right. He had 3 years to feel right about it. In the summer of 1512, a Spanish army entered Italy in support of an effort to restore the Medici to Florence. The army was professional, experienced, and commanded by officers who had spent years fighting wars that were nothing like the managed conflicts of the Italian mercenary tradition. They did not maneuver for position. They did not calculate the cost of pressing an advantage. They advanced. They encountered resistance at Prato, a small town near Florence. In August of 1512, the forces defending Prato were mixed. Not solely Machiavelli's militia, but the militia formed a significant part of them. When the Spanish artillery opened up and the professional infantry advanced with the specific, unhurried ferocity of men who had done this before, the defence collapsed, not slowly, not after a creditable resistance that was simply overwhelmed by superior force. The defenders broke when they faced an army that was serious in the way that the forces they had encountered before were not. What followed at Prato was a massacre of devastating scale. The Spanish soldiers, given the town after its defenders fled, killed thousands of people. The accounts of what happened there circulated through Florence with the speed that atrocity always travels, and the political effect was immediate and total. The Florentine government collapsed within days. The Medici were restored. The Republic was over. Machiavelli sat with the failure of Prato for the rest of his life. Not with guilt exactly, though the records suggest he felt responsibility. A responsibility that was not entirely fair, given that the militia had been sent to defend a position against a force it was never designed to face, but with something harder and more durable than guilt, with the question that the failure had forced on him about his own most fundamental assumptions. He had believed that the motivational difference between citizens and mercenaries would overcome the training and experience gap between an amateur force and a professional army. He had been partly right. The militia had performed adequately against the kinds of forces it had been designed to face. But he had underestimated the degree to which motivation, however genuine, has a threshold beyond which it cannot carry an untrained force against professionals who have been forged by years of actual war. The men who broke at Prato were not cowards in any useful sense of the word. They were farmers and labourers who had been given basic military training and placed in front of the most experienced army in Europe. Their response was the rational response of people whose preparation had been exceeded by their situation. But the lesson Machiavelli took from this was not simply a technical one about military training. It was a deeper lesson about the relationship between ideals and institutions. The gap between what a thing should be and what a thing can actually become when it is built with the materials the world provides rather than the materials the theory requires. The right idea is the beginning. Building the thing that can actually survive contact with reality is the work, and it is harder than the idea, and it fails in ways that the idea does not predict. He had designed the militia for the world as he wanted it to be. The world as it was had shown up at Prato with Spanish infantry and no interest in the distinction. He was 43 years old. He had just watched everything he built collapse in an afternoon, and the people who had been restored to power by that collapse were about to make his situation considerably worse. Chapter 4. Torture, Exile, and a desk in the country. The kind of loss that takes everything at once has a specific quality that other losses do not. It is different from the loss that comes gradually, that gives you time to adjust, to find alternative ground to stand on, to mourn one thing before the next thing goes. The loss that arrives all at once produces a specific kind of stillness. The ground simply is not there anymore, and for a moment, before the practical questions begin, there is just that, the absence of the ground. Machiavelli lost everything in the autumn of 1512. The Medici returned to Florence in September. Within weeks, the institutions of the Republic were dissolved or restructured beyond recognition. In November, he was dismissed from his position as Second Chancellor. The 14 years of service, the hundreds of diplomatic missions, the reports and letters and negotiations, and the militia he had built from nothing, none of it counted for anything in the new accounting. He had served the Republic. The Republic was gone. He was a liability. He was also, almost immediately, under suspicion. The restored Medici government was doing what every government does when it consolidates power after a period of opposition. It was identifying the people who might cause problems and finding ways to neutralize them. Machiavelli was an obvious candidate for this kind of attention. He had been a senior official of the opposing government. He was known to be intelligent and well-connected. He had spent 14 years building relationships across the political landscape of Florence and beyond. He was prohibited from leaving Florentine territory for 1 year. He was required to post a financial bond as a guarantee of his compliance. He was, in practical terms, under house arrest in his own city, living on a property he still owned, but with no income, no position, and no clear path to either. He was managing this situation, uncomfortable but not yet dangerous. When the conspiracy arrived, in February of 1513, a young man named Pietro Paolo Boscoli was arrested in Florence in connection with a plot against the Medici. Under interrogation, Boscoli gave names. Among the names on a list found in his possession was Niccolò Machiavelli. The historical record is clear that Machiavelli's connection to the conspiracy, if it existed at all, was peripheral at best and non-existent at most. There is no evidence that he was involved in any planning or that he had prior knowledge of what was being organized. His name on a list proved nothing except that someone knew his name and wrote it down. But evidence was not the standard being applied. The Medici government was running a security operation. and the security operation required that everyone on the list be brought in. He was arrested and taken to the Bargello. He was subjected to the strappado. The strappado was one of the standard methods of judicial torture in Renaissance Italy. The prisoner's hands were bound behind his back and attached to a rope that ran over a pulley mounted in the ceiling. The prisoner was hauled up until his feet left the ground, held there, and then dropped suddenly, stopped before hitting the floor by the tension in the rope. The jolt transmitted through the bound arms and shoulders with a force that could dislocate joints and shatter the composure of men who had believed themselves capable of endurance. It was designed not merely to cause pain, but to demonstrate, through the body's helplessness, that the prisoner's will was no longer the relevant variable. Machiavelli endured it. He did not confess to involvement in the conspiracy. He did not implicate others. He maintained, through repeated applications of a torture that was designed to break determined resistance, that he had no knowledge of what the conspirators had planned and no part in it. This detail sits in most accounts of Machiavelli's life without receiving the attention it deserves. It is mentioned, briefly noted, and moved past in the rush toward the more famous facts that follow, but it is, in its quiet way, the most revealing single thing in the biographical record. Everything else Machiavelli wrote or did or said tells us about his mind. This tells us about his character. A man who had spent 14 years studying the mechanics of power, who understood better than almost anyone alive what torture was designed to accomplish and how it worked, held under it and told them nothing. Not because he was protecting others, because there was nothing to tell. He was released in March of 1513, when the new Pope, Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, issued a general amnesty upon his election to the papacy. Machiavelli walked out of the Bargello after weeks of imprisonment and torture with no confession on the record, no money, no position, and no prospects. He went to his farm, the farm at Sant'Andrea in Percasina, in the hills south of Florence, was a working agricultural property with a stone farmhouse that smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, and the particular mustiness of rooms that are kept closed through winter. The fire in the main room was reliable if you fed it constantly, and sulky if you did not. The windows were small, and the light inside was always slightly dim, even on bright days, the kind of light that makes the afternoon feel later than it is. He managed the property. He supervised the wood-cutting. He argued with the labourers about prices in a way that he described in his letters, with a dry self-awareness about the distance between these disputes and the disputes he had been part of 3 months earlier. He played cards at the local inn with the miller and the butcher. He lost small amounts of money he could not afford to lose. He drank the rough local wine and listened to gossip about people he did not care about. He was, by any external measure, a ruined man filling his hours with activities that had nothing to do with the 14 years he had just spent. And then the evening came. The letter that Machiavelli wrote to his friend Francesco Vettori on the 10th of December, 1513, is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of Western letters. Vettori was a Florentine diplomat who had managed to maintain his position under the restored Medici and was stationed in Rome as the Florentine ambassador to the papal court. Machiavelli had been corresponding with him throughout the autumn, partly to maintain the connection, partly to seek Vettori's help in finding some path back to employment, and partly because Vettori was one of the few people he trusted enough to be completely honest with. The letter describes his daily routine, with the deadpan precision of a man who has made a private peace with his own humiliation. He describes the morning in the fields, the arguments with the woodcutters, the afternoon at the inn playing cards with the miller and the butcher, the rough wine, the gossip. He does not pretend to find it ennobling. He describes it for what it is. And then he describes what happens when the evening comes. He writes that when evening arrives, he returns to the house and goes into his study. At the door he takes off the muddy, sweaty clothes of the day, and puts on regal and courtly garments. Dressed appropriately, he enters the ancient courts of ancient men. There he is received kindly. He feeds on the food that alone is his and for which he was born. He is not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reasons for their actions. And they, out of their humanity, answer him, and for 4 hours he feels no boredom. He forgets every trouble. He does not dread poverty, and death does not frighten him. He gives himself over entirely to them. He then tells Vittori that he has composed a small work on principalities, and that he is thinking of dedicating it to a member of the Medici family. He has put into it everything he knows about the subject, he says, and he hopes it will be received as evidence of his usefulness. The book he is describing is The Prince. The letter is extraordinary for several reasons, but perhaps the most important is what it reveals about the relationship between the humiliation of the exile and the freedom of the writing. Machiavelli had just been tortured, dismissed, and reduced to arguing about firewood with labourers who did not know or care who he was. He had no audience, no platform, no institutional position from which to speak. He had no reason to believe the book he was writing would find readers or change anything. And in that condition, stripped of everything the professional life had provided, he wrote with a clarity and a fearlessness that his years of diplomatic service, for all their value, had not produced. When you are already at the bottom, there is no career to protect. There is only the truth as you understand it, and the question of whether you have the honesty to write it down. He had the honesty. The next months at Sant'Andrea were months of intense work. He was reading the ancient historians alongside his own notes from 14 years of diplomatic observation, holding them together, finding the patterns that repeated across 20 centuries of political experience, and distilling those patterns into the short, precisi, unsentimental chapters that would become the most controversial book in the history of political thought. He was also, even as he wrote, still trying to find his way back. The letters to Vittori during this period move between the intellectual excitement of the work and the practical desperation of a man who knows that exile is not a sustainable condition. He asks Vittori to put in a word. He suggests ways he might be useful to the Medici government. He offers his knowledge, his experience, his willingness to work in any capacity that might be available. He is not ashamed of this. He needs a job. He says so plainly. The Medici did not respond. The book was finished by the end of 1513. It did not produce the employment Machiavelli was hoping for. It circulated in manuscript among a limited number of readers. It was not published in Machiavelli's lifetime. He stayed at the farm and kept writing. Because the work had become something beyond a job application, it had become, in the silence and the indignity of the exile, the thing that remained when everything else had been taken. The ideas were his. The desk was his. The ancient men in their courtly garments who received him kindly in the evenings and answered his questions without asking what he had done to deserve their company were his. Nobody could dismiss him from that room, or take his bond, or prohibit him from crossing its threshold. And in that room, dressed in his finest clothes against the darkness of the Tuscan countryside, with the fire burning low and the night pressing against the small windows, talking to people who had been dead for 2,000 years about the things that mattered most, Niccolò Machiavelli was doing the only thing he had ever really wanted to do. He was trying to understand the world as it actually was. Chapter 5. The Prince. What he actually wrote. Almost everyone has an opinion about this book. Almost no one has read it carefully. It is not a long book. In most modern editions, it runs to roughly 80 pages of actual text, shorter than many magazine articles, shorter than the average business report. A person of average reading speed could finish it in an afternoon. And yet the gap between what the book actually says and what people believe it says is one of the largest such gaps in the entire history of Western literature. The Prince was written in 1513 by a man who had just been tortured and exiled, and who was trying simultaneously to think clearly about politics and to get his old job back. Those two purposes pull in different directions. And understanding that tension is the first step toward understanding what the book actually is and what it is not. It is not a manual for tyrants. It is not a celebration of cruelty. It is not, as is often attributed to Cardinal Reginald Pole writing in the 16th century, a document written by the finger of Satan. It is a short, precise, often uncomfortable book about how power actually works, written by a man who had spent 14 years watching power at close range and who had decided, in the specific freedom of his disgrace, to write down what he had seen without the diplomatic softening that his previous position had required. The book opens with a dedication to Lorenzo de' Medici. The dedication has been read as sycophancy, as the desperate flattery of a dismissed official trying to attract a patron. Read more carefully. It is something more ambiguous and more interesting. Machiavelli compares himself to a cartographer who surveys the landscape from the lowlands to understand the mountains, and from the mountains to understand the lowlands. He is telling Lorenzo that the view from the bottom, from the position of the dismissed official who has nothing left to protect, is the view that produces the clearest map. It is not a humble opening. It is a confident one, dressed in the language of humility. The first section covers the different kinds of principalities and how they are acquired. He distinguishes between hereditary states, where the ruler inherits power from a long line of predecessors, and new states, where the ruler has come to power through his own ability, or through fortune, or through crime, or through the favour of others. Most of the book is concerned with the new state, because the new state is where the interesting problems are. The hereditary ruler simply has to avoid being spectacularly incompetent. The new ruler has to build something from nothing, and building something from nothing is where the mechanics of power become visible in the way they never are when the system is running smoothly. He then introduces the figures who would define his reputation forever. He discusses Moses, Romulus, Cyrus, and Theseus as examples of men who built states through their own ability and who succeeded because they were armed. He then discusses Savonarola as an example of an unarmed prophet, a man who built power on the basis of his followers' belief and then lost everything when the belief wavered, because he had no force with which to compel those whose faith had failed. He had watched Savonarola burn in the Piazza della Signoria 15 years earlier. He did not need to theorize about this. This passage is where Machiavelli first uses a phrase that has been quoted ever since in contexts that systematically misread it. He writes that all armed prophets have conquered and unarmed ones have been destroyed. This has been taken as evidence of his cynicism. His belief that force is the only thing that matters in politics. But the argument is more precise than that. He is not saying that force is better than persuasion. He is saying that persuasion without the capacity for force is inherently unstable, because it depends entirely on the continuation of belief. And belief is a variable that the leader cannot control. The chapter on Cesare Borgia is the most personal in the book. Machiavelli had spent months at Borgia's court. He describes Borgia's methods with a specificity that could only come from direct observation, and his assessment of Borgia as a model for new princes to study has been taken as evidence of his moral bankruptcy more than any other single passage in the book. But read carefully. The chapter on Borgia is not an endorsement. It is a case study with a precise analytical conclusion. Machiavelli praises Borgia's methods not because he thinks cruelty is good, but because he thinks Borgia's problem was not his methods, but his dependency. Borgia built everything correctly and was destroyed by a single factor he could not control: his father's death at the wrong moment. The lesson is not that you should be like Borgia. The lesson is that you should be like Borgia, except that you should not build your entire structure on a foundation you do not control. The middle section of the book addresses the question of soldiers, and here the years of watching mercenaries underperform and his own militia face its limits at Prato come together in the clearest synthesis. Machiavelli argues that a prince who relies on mercenary or auxiliary forces is building on a foundation that will collapse at the worst possible moment, because the incentives of hired soldiers are never fully aligned with the interests of the state they are supposed to protect. And then comes chapter 15, which is where the prince stops being a military and political manual and becomes something else entirely, something that frightened readers in the 16th century and still unsettles readers today, not because it is evil, but because it is honest in a way that most political writing carefully avoids being. Machiavelli writes that many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in reality, and that there is such a gap between how one lives and how one should live, that anyone who abandons what is done for what should be done will learn his ruin rather than his preservation. He is not rejecting the idea that rulers should be good. He is rejecting the usefulness of advice that assumes the ruler can simply choose to be good without regard for the consequences that choice produces in a world where not everyone else has made the same choice. This is the core of what people call Machiavellian, and it is worth sitting with it rather than rushing past it. He is saying that in the real world, a ruler who behaves according to the principles of moral philosophy in every circumstance will be destroyed by rulers who do not. He is not celebrating this fact. He is stating it as a condition of the world he observed. And he is saying that political advice that ignores this condition is not moral. It is dangerous, because it sends people into real situations equipped with tools designed for a different reality. Remember the question we asked at the beginning of this story. Can a man who loved his city honestly, who served it faithfully, who saw it clearly, be the person history remembers as a villain? Or did we misread him because the truth he was telling was the one we least wanted to hear? Chapter 15 is where that question becomes most acute. Because what Machiavelli is doing in that chapter is not recommending evil. He is telling the reader that evil exists in the world, and that pretending otherwise does not make it go away. It only makes you less prepared for it. Chapter 17, On Cruelty and Mercy, is the passage that has produced more misreadings than any other. Machiavelli writes that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. This sentence has been quoted thousands of times as evidence of his contempt for human decency. What the sentence actually says, in context, is considerably more nuanced. He argues that love is an unreliable foundation for power because it depends on the freely given loyalty of others, which can be withdrawn when it becomes inconvenient. Fear, properly managed, is more reliable because it depends on the prince's own conduct rather than on the choices of others. But he then immediately qualifies this by saying that the prince must avoid being hated, because hatred destroys the utility of fear and produces opposition that fear alone cannot manage. The argument is not that cruelty is good. It is that the effectiveness of mercy or cruelty depends entirely on the specific situation, and that the prince who applies either absolutely, without regard for context, is making a political error. Chapter 18, On How Princes Should Keep Their Word, is the most controversial in the book and the most carefully reasoned. Machiavelli argues that a prince who keeps his word in all circumstances will be destroyed by those who do not, and that therefore a wise prince must know how to use both the nature of the man and the nature of the beast. He uses the image of the lion and the fox, the lion to frighten the wolves, the fox to recognize the traps. A prince who is only a lion does not see the traps. A prince who is only a fox cannot frighten the wolves. What Machiavelli is describing in these chapters is not an ideal, it is a condition. He is telling his reader that the world contains people who will use every available tool to achieve their objectives, and that a ruler who responds to this fact by committing to virtue regardless of consequences is not being noble. He is being negligent toward the people who depend on his leadership. The final chapter of The Prince is the one that is least often discussed and most important for understanding who Machiavelli actually was. It is an exhortation, a call to action addressed to whoever might take up the challenge of liberating Italy from foreign domination. By 1513, Italy had been invaded, occupied, and fought over by France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire for nearly 20 years. The peninsula that had been the centre of European civilization was being divided among powers that treated it as a prize rather than a place. Machiavelli ends his cold-eyed, unsentimental manual on the mechanics of power with a passage of genuine passion. He writes that Italy is ready and willing to follow a banner if only someone will raise it. He invokes Moses, leading his people out of Egypt, Cyrus finding the Persians ready to rise, and he says that Italy's suffering has been greater, and that if someone of the quality he has been describing throughout the book will take up the task, the opportunity is there. This ending has been called naive, even hypocritical, given the unsentimental analysis that precedes it. But it is neither of these things. It is the logical conclusion of everything that came before. Machiavelli has spent the entire book analysing how power works, because he believes that understanding is the prerequisite for using power in the service of something worth serving. The cold analysis is in the service of a warm end. The realism is the instrument of an idealism that has learned Through 14 years of observation and one very bad winter at Sant'Andrea in Percasina, that ideals ungrounded in reality are not noble. They are useless. He wanted Italy to be free. He thought the way to get there was to understand the world honestly, and the Prince is his honest account of the world he understood. Chapter 6. The Discourses and the Republican Heart. If the Prince is the book that made Machiavelli's reputation, the Discourses on Livy is the book that reveals his actual beliefs. The problem is that far fewer people have read it. This is partly a matter of length. The Discourses is a long book, 3 volumes of close analysis of the first 10 books of Livy's history of Rome, with digressions and arguments that accumulate over hundreds of pages into something more like a sustained philosophical investigation than the compressed political manual of the Prince. It does not have the same dramatic shape. It does not move with the same urgency. It requires patience, but the patience is rewarded. Because the Discourses contain something the Prince does not and cannot contain, given its context and its form, it contains Machiavelli's considered view, developed without the pressure of trying to attract a patron or demonstrate usefulness to a new government, of what a good political order actually looks like. And that view is not the view of a man who believed in the rule of princes. The Discourses was written during the same period as The Prince. Beginning in 1513 and continuing for several years afterward, Machiavelli was working on both simultaneously, which means that the man writing the cold analysis of how princes must sometimes use force and deception was also, in the same months and at the same desk, writing a sustained argument for the superiority of republican government. This simultaneity is the key to resolving what has seemed to many readers like a contradiction between the 2 books. He was not contradicting himself. He was doing 2 different things. The Prince was a diagnosis of how power works in the conditions that actually exist. The Discourses was a map of what political life could look like if the conditions were right. One was written for the world as it was. The other was written for the world as it could be. Both were written by the same man with the same commitment to honesty. And the honesty of both required that they be different books. The Discourses opens with a statement that announces its ambition in a single sentence. Machiavelli writes that he has decided to enter upon a path as yet untrodden by anyone, which, if it brings him some trouble and difficulty, may also bring him reward through those who kindly consider the end to which his labours are directed. He is aware that he is doing something new. He is aware it will be controversial. He is doing it anyway. The new thing he is doing is treating Livy's history of Rome not as a collection of inspiring stories, but as a body of evidence about political mechanics. He is reading Roman history the way an engineer reads experimental data, looking for the principles that explain why some structures held and others collapsed, with the specific intention of drawing conclusions that apply to the present. His central argument in the first book of the Discourses is one that stands in direct contrast to the necessary compromises of The Prince. He argues that republics are superior to principalities not as a matter of moral preference, but as a matter of institutional design. A republic distributes the risks of leadership across a wider set of actors, which means that the failure of any single individual is less likely to be catastrophic. A republic creates citizens who have a stake in the system's success, which produces a different quality of commitment from the calculated loyalty of subjects who obey because they fear punishment. A republic has mechanisms for self-correction. for identifying and removing leaders who have failed or become corrupt, that principalities lack by design. He makes this argument through Rome. The greatness of Rome, he argues, was not primarily the product of great individual leaders. Though Rome produced more than its share of those, it was the product of institutions that were designed to survive the failures of individuals, that could absorb the ambition and the weakness and the corruption that individuals inevitably produce and continue functioning because the structure was larger than any single person in it. The Roman constitution, in Machiavelli's reading, was great not because it was perfectly designed, but because it was designed to be imperfect in productive ways. The conflict between the Roman Senate and the tribunes of the plebes, the ongoing tension between the aristocratic and the popular elements of the Roman political system, was not a defect in the Roman system. It was the source of Roman liberty. The conflict kept both sides honest. It prevented either the aristocracy or the people from accumulating unchecked power. It forced compromise and adaptation. It was messy and contentious, and productive of exactly the kind of vigorous political life that free societies require and that comfortable, orderly principalities systematically suppress. This argument is radical in the context of the political thought of Machiavelli's era, and it remains relevant in ways that are worth attending to today. He is saying that political conflict, the thing that most political systems are designed to minimize or eliminate, is not a problem to be solved. It is a feature to be maintained. The republic that has no serious conflict between competing interests is not a republic that has achieved harmony. It is a republic in which one interest has succeeded in suppressing all the others, which is a different thing entirely, and a much more dangerous one. He is also making an argument about the relationship between civic virtue and political institutions that runs counter to both the idealism of the humanist tradition and the hard realism of the prince. The humanists of his era believed that good political outcomes required virtuous leaders, men of education and wisdom, who could guide their cities toward the good through the quality of their personal character. Machiavelli had spent 14 years watching virtuous men lead their cities to catastrophe and ruthless men occasionally build something that lasted, and his conclusion was that personal virtue, however admirable, was not a reliable foundation for political order. But he was not, in the discourses, retreating to the bleak pragmatism of the prince. He was arguing for something more sophisticated than either idealism or realism. He was arguing that institutions could be designed to produce adequate outcomes even with ordinary, imperfect, self-interested human beings as their raw material, if the incentive structures within those institutions were correctly aligned. The Roman system worked not because Romans were better people than other people, but because the Roman system created conditions in which the self-interest of competing groups happened to align with the overall good of the Republic in enough situations to keep things functioning. This argument helped shape the broader Republican tradition that influenced the thinking of the men who designed the American constitutional system 2 centuries later. The scholars who have studied this connection, particularly J.G.A. Pocock in his work The Machiavellian Moment, and Bernard Bailyn in his work on the ideological origins of the American Revolution, have traced the intellectual pathways carefully, noting that the transmission was not always direct or conscious, but was real and consequential. When James Madison wrote in Federalist 51 that ambition must be made to counteract ambition, he was working within a tradition of thinking about institutional design that Machiavelli had helped establish at its foundation. The second book of the Discourses is concerned primarily with Rome's military expansion and the role of military power in the maintenance of republican liberty. Here, the arguments of the Prince and the Discourses converge most clearly. Machiavelli insists again that citizen soldiers fight differently from mercenaries, and that a republic that relies on hired force is trading its long-term security for short-term convenience. He extends the argument about military self-sufficiency into a broader claim about the relationship between military service and civic identity, arguing that the act of defending the Republic with your own body produces a relationship to the Republic that cannot be replicated by any other means. The third book of the Discourses is where Machiavelli's analysis gets closest to the questions about individual character and leadership that drove him throughout his career. He examines the qualities of Roman leaders who saved the Republic in moments of crisis and the qualities of those who damaged or destroyed it. And the analysis produces a picture of leadership that is more nuanced than either the Prince or the popular image of Machiavelli would suggest. He argues that the greatest leaders in Republican history were not those who were most consistently successful or most consistently virtuous. They were those who were capable of adaptation, who could read the specific demands of their specific moment and match their conduct to those demands, rather than applying the same approach regardless of context. He uses the contrast between Fabius Maximus, the Roman general who saved Rome through cautious delay during Hannibal's invasion, and Scipio Africanus, who defeated Carthage through bold offensive action. To illustrate the point, neither approach was universally superior. Fabius's caution would have failed against a different enemy in a different situation. Scipio's boldness would have been catastrophic against Hannibal. The virtue was not in the method. It was in the judgment about which method the situation required. This argument connects directly to one of the central concepts of the entire Machiavellian corpus, the concept he calls virtue. The word has been translated as virtue, as ability, as prowess, as excellence, and none of these translations quite captures what he means by it. Virtue, in Machiavelli's usage, is the quality of being able to act decisively and effectively in the face of circumstances that resist your wishes and your plans. It is not a moral quality in the conventional sense. Though it is not incompatible with morality, it is a capacity, the capacity to find the action that the moment requires and to execute it without the hesitation that comes from fear or the paralysis that comes from excessive caution. The opposite of virtue is not vice. It is passivity, the surrender of the field to fortune because the situation seems too complex or too dangerous to engage with directly. And fortune, as Machiavelli understood it from 30 years of watching it operate, was not a gentle or patient force. It was, as he wrote in one of the most famous passages in The Prince, like a violent river that when it floods overwhelms the plains, uproots trees, destroys buildings, moves earth from one place to another. Against a river in flood you cannot do much, but when it is not flooding, you can build embankments and channels that will contain the next flood when it comes. The Discourses ends not with a conclusion in the formal sense, but with an accumulation of examples and arguments that point toward a single underlying conviction. Machiavelli believed that free political life was possible. He believed it was possible not because human beings were naturally good or naturally rational or naturally inclined toward cooperation, because his 14 years of observation had given him no grounds for believing any of those things. He believed it was possible because Rome had achieved it, imperfectly and temporarily, and at great cost. And because the mechanics that Rome had used were not specific to Rome, they were human mechanics, available to any society that had the honesty to understand its own situation and the courage to build institutions adequate to that understanding. He had been exiled. He had been tortured. He had been stripped of the career he had built over 14 years. He had watched the militia he created face its limits in an afternoon. He had watched the republic he served dissolve under military pressure, and he still believed in the republic, not because the belief was comfortable or because it had been validated by his experience, because the analysis pointed to it, and because a man who has spent his entire life trying to see the world as it actually is does not abandon the conclusions of that seeing simply because the world has been unkind to him personally. Can a man who loved his city honestly and served it faithfully be the villain that history made him? We are not there yet, but the desk is still lit. The candle is still low, and the ancient men are still answering his questions. The story is not finished. Chapter 7. The Playwright, the Poot, the Man Laughing. The version of Niccolò Machiavelli that the history of ideas has preserved with great care and considerable distortion is the version of the cold analyst, the man who looked at power without blinking, who stripped away the comfortable illusions of political philosophy and replaced them with a description of the world that made his contemporaries reach for words like diabolical and satanic, because they had no neutral vocabulary for what he was doing. That version is real. The analysis is real. The cold eye is real. But it is not the whole man, and the part that it leaves out is not a minor detail or a biographical footnote. It is, in certain respects, the most revealing part of the record, the part that tells you not just what Machiavelli thought, but how he lived inside his thinking, how he carried the weight of what he had seen and understood, and lost without being crushed by it. Machiavelli was, by the testimony of everyone who knew him, one of the funniest people in Florence, not funny in the polite, controlled way of a man who has cultivated wit as a social instrument, though he had that too, funny in the deeper way, the way that requires genuine attention to the specific absurdity of specific human beings in specific situations, the kind of humour that is always, at its foundation, a form of love, because you cannot find something genuinely funny without finding it genuinely interesting, and you cannot find people genuinely interesting without caring about them in some basic and durable way. The evidence for this is not second-hand. It is in the letters, in the plays, in the verse, in the record of the circle of friends that formed around him in the years of his exile, and that became the most important intellectual community in Florence during the 1510s and 1520s. After the first difficult years of exile at Sant'Andrea in Percasina, Machiavelli began to find his way back into Florentine intellectual life through a group that gathered at the Orti Oricellari, the gardens of the Ruscelli family on the edge of the city. The gardens had a long tradition as a meeting place for humanist discussion, and the group that Machiavelli joined there included some of the most interesting minds in Florence. Young men of good families who were interested in history, literature, and political thought, and who found in Machiavelli a teacher unlike any other they had encountered. He was in his mid-40s by this point, older than most of the men in the group, and the combination of his age, his experience, and his specific quality of attention made him a magnetic figure in those conversations. He was not a performer in the academic sense, not a man who delivered polished lectures and waited for applause. He was a talker, a questioner, a man who moved through ideas with the same quick restlessness that had characterized his diplomatic dispatches, picking up a thread, following it until it revealed something interesting, dropping it when it stopped being productive and moving on to the next one. He was also, in the evenings after those conversations, going home to Marietta. Marietta Corsini had married him in 1501. When he was 32 years old, and at the beginning of what would prove to be the most productive decade of his professional life, she was a Florentine woman of modest background, practical in the way that people are practical when they have to manage a household with limited resources and a husband who is almost never there. They would have 6 children together across the years of the marriage, and the record of their relationship that survives in the letters is not a romantic record in the conventional sense. It is something more honest and more durable than romance. Marietta wrote to her husband during his long absences with the directness of a woman who has decided that pretending to feel better about something than she does is a waste of everyone's time. She told him she was managing. She told him the children were well. She told him she was not entirely happy about the situation of being left alone in Florence with a household to run while he travelled the courts of Italy. France and the Holy Roman Empire. There is no performance in these letters, no effort to shape how she appears to the reader. She sounds like a capable woman dealing competently with a difficult situation and not pretending otherwise. Machiavelli wrote back with affection. He described the places he had been and the people he had met, often with the same dry observational humour that characterized his best writing. He asked after the children by name. He expressed, in the clipped and practical language that men of his era used for such things, something that was genuinely warm. He loved his family. He was also almost never there. The tension between those two facts was never fully resolved, and it appears in the record without apology or explanation, simply as one of the conditions of the life he was living. What the letters reveal, held together with the plays and the verse and the correspondence with his friends, is a man whose emotional life was considerably richer and more complicated than the standard portrait allows. He was not the cold-eyed analyst all the way down. He was a man who had built a family in the margins of a career that left almost no room for one, who loved his wife and his children with the specific and slightly guilty love of someone who knows he has not given them enough of his time, and who carried that knowledge alongside the ideas and the observations and the years of watching power operate in ways that most people preferred not to see. It was for the Orti Oristolari group, and for the broader Florentine audience that would encounter his work in performance, that he wrote the plays. The Mandragola was probably written around 1518, though the exact date is uncertain. It was performed in Florence, and almost certainly in Rome as well, and its reception was the kind that writers dream about and rarely receive. It was a hit, not a polite success or a critical success. A genuine hit, with audiences that laughed out loud and came back and talked about it afterward with the specific animated pleasure of people who have been genuinely entertained rather than merely edified. The plot is, by the standards of the political philosophy that surrounds it, almost shockingly bawdy. A young man named Callimaco is in love with Lucrezia, the beautiful and virtuous wife of Nisia, a wealthy and spectacularly foolish Florentine citizen. Callimaco wants to sleep with Lucrezia, Ligurio, a social parasite and fixer of great ingenuity, devises the plan. They will convince Nicia that Lucrezia is infertile, and that the only cure is a potion made from the mandrake root, which has the dangerous side effect that the first man to sleep with the woman after she takes it will die. Nicia, being both desperately eager for an heir and spectacularly gullible, agrees to find a young man to serve as the sacrificial partner, not knowing that the young man will be Callimaco in disguise. Fra Timoteo, a corrupt and easily bribed friar, is recruited to provide religious cover for the arrangement, and Lucrezia herself, persuaded by her mother and by Fra Timoteo that the scheme is morally acceptable because the end is a good one, agrees to participate. The play is a comedy. It is also, and this is why it has been regularly revived and performed across 5 centuries and is still funny to audiences today, a devastatingly precise dissection of the specific ways that intelligent people rationalize the things they want to do anyway. Nicia is not stupid exactly. He is the kind of fool who has read enough to believe himself wise, which is worse than simple stupidity because it adds a layer of self-satisfaction to the ordinary failures of judgment. His eagerness for an heir, which is a reasonable desire, has been so thoroughly exploited by the people around him that he ends the play having arranged his own cuckolding and believing himself to have been unusually clever about it. Fra Timoteo is the character who has attracted the most attention from scholars, and for good reason. He is a man of the church who is, at his core, a man of business. His religious convictions are entirely flexible in the face of small sums of money. His moral reasoning is available for hire, and yet he is not a villain in the melodramatic sense. He is something more recognizable and more troubling. A man of genuine intelligence who has applied that intelligence entirely to the project of remaining comfortable, and who has rationalized his compromises so thoroughly that he may not entirely know where the rationalization ends and the genuine belief begins. This character does not come from abstract moral philosophy. He comes from observation. Machiavelli had spent years watching institutions that were supposed to serve the public good being operated by people who were primarily serving their own interests. And Fra Timoteo is the theatrical expression of that observation. He is funny because he is precisely drawn. He is precisely drawn because he is true. Any audience, in any century, recognizes him immediately, because every institution in every era produces people who are, at their core, Fra Timoteo. Lucrezia is the most interesting character in the play, and the one most often overlooked in discussions that focus on the comic mechanics of the plot. She is presented at the beginning as genuinely virtuous, and her virtue is not shown as a performance or a social mask. She has actual moral convictions, and she is not easily moved from them. The process by which she is persuaded to go along with the scheme, through a combination of her mother's pressure and Fra Timoteo's sophisticated theological rationalization, is the most carefully written section of the play and the most unsettling, because Machiavelli does not present her final consent as a failure of character. He presents it as a rational response to a situation in which the people she trusted most have given her reasons that she cannot immediately counter, and in which the social and institutional structures that should have protected her have been thoroughly corrupted by the time they reach her. She is not fooled. She is outmaneuvered, and at the end of the play, when she decides to make the best of the situation she has been placed in, she does it with a clear-eyed practicality that is the closest thing in the play to genuine dignity. This is the analytical Machiavelli at his most humane. He is showing how systems fail their members. He is showing how good intentions, bad institution, and rational self-interest combine to produce outcomes that none of the individual actors would have chosen if they had been able to see the full picture from the beginning. And he is doing it while making audiences laugh, which is the hardest possible way to do serious intellectual work and the most durable. The letters from this period, particularly the long correspondence with Francesco Guicciardini that developed after 1513 and continued until Machiavelli's death, reveal a dimension of the man that the political works only glimpse. Guicciardini was one of the great historians of the Renaissance, a man of considerable intelligence and considerable wealth who had managed to maintain a position of influence through the various political upheavals that had destroyed Machiavelli's career. The two men had a friendship built on genuine mutual respect and on the specific pleasure of talking with someone who is your intellectual equal and who will not pretend to agree with you when they do not. The letters are funny, not performatively funny, not the kind of humour designed to display wit, but the kind of humour that comes from two intelligent people looking at the same absurdity and finding that they see the same thing in it. They argue about politics and history and the nature of fortune and the possibilities of good government. They discuss the practical details of their respective situations with a frankness that is possible only between people who trust each other completely. They make jokes about the men they are both, at various points, trying to work for. In one famous exchange, Machiavelli writes to Guicciardini about a mission he has been sent on to adjudicate a dispute between two Franciscan friars over the right to preach in a particular town. He describes the situation with deadpan precision, noting that he has found himself the author of works that the Church would eventually place on its list of forbidden books, serving as the arbiter of a theological dispute between men who have dedicated their lives to an institution that had little affection for his ideas. The humour is the humour of a man who has looked at the gap between his situation and his dignity so long that the gap itself has become a source of pleasure rather than pain. He also wrote verse throughout this period, poems in the vernacular tradition that have been largely overshadowed by the prose works, but that reveal yet another facet of a mind that the standard portrait consistently underestimates. The poems are more personal than the elevated philosophical verse of the humanist tradition, more immediate, more interested in the texture of daily experience. There is warmth in them that the political works, with their deliberate discipline of tone, can only occasionally afford to show. The voice in those poems is the voice of a man who found the world genuinely beautiful, even while seeing it clearly, who had not let the clarity harden into coldness. He was alive, fully, specifically, often amusingly alive. He loved his friends. He loved his family in the complicated way of someone who has consistently put other things first and knows it. He enjoyed the evenings at the Orti Oristolari. He found the comedy of the human situation, the gap between what people said and what they did, between the dignity they claimed and the foolishness they demonstrated, endlessly interesting rather than depressing. Because for Machiavelli, as for the best comic writers in any tradition, the recognition of that gap was not a reason for despair. It was the beginning of understanding. And understanding, as he had believed since he was a young man, watching the aftermath of the Pazzi Conspiracy from somewhere in the streets of Florence, was the only tool that could be trusted. He was also, even as he wrote and laughed and argued with his friends and went home to Marietta and the children, still trying to get his old job back. That effort, and the way history kept intervening to prevent it, is the story of the last 15 years of his life. And it is a story about something that even the most sophisticated analysis cannot always protect you from: bad timing. Chapter 8. The Return That Never Came. A specific cruelty belongs to the situation of the person who has the right qualities for a job that no longer exists, who has the right experience for a world that has moved on, who understands the situation better than the people currently managing it, but cannot find a way back into the room where the managing happens. It is not the dramatic cruelty of sudden loss or violent reversal. It is the slow cruelty of continued exclusion from the place where you know you could be useful. The cruelty of being visible enough that the people in power know who you are, and close enough to the centre that you can see the decisions being made, but far enough away that you cannot influence them. This was Machiavelli's situation for the last 15 years of his life, and navigating it required every resource he had, and ultimately proved that some situations cannot be navigated out of, regardless of the intelligence applied to them. The years between 1513 and 1519 were years of patient, systematic effort to re-establish himself with the Medici government that had dismissed him. He was not naive about what this required. He understood that the Medici did not trust him, and that he had given them some reasons not to, through his long service to the Republic and through the associations that service had created. He also understood that he had something they needed, the kind of administrative and diplomatic experience that was expensive to develop and difficult to replace, and that the question was whether he could make that usefulness visible enough that the distrust would be set aside. He tried the indirect approach first. The letters to Francesco Vettori in Rome, asking Vettori to put in a word, to track, to mention his name in the right context, to suggest to the right people that his skills might be worth having. Vettori tried, with the limited enthusiasm of a man who had his own position to protect and did not want to spend political capital on a cause that might not succeed. The results were minimal. He tried the direct approach. The prince itself was in part a direct approach, a demonstration of the quality of his thinking addressed to the people who held the authority to employ him. It did not produce the result he had hoped for. The Medici, when they did encounter it, seemed to have found it interesting without finding it personally compelling in the way Machiavelli needed them to find it. He tried the institutional approach. In 1515, he began associating more actively with the group at the Orti Oricellari, which had connections to the Medici through several of its members. The discourses were circulating among the group, and the group included men who had direct access to the people making decisions about government appointments. This approach eventually produced something. It produced the Commission for the History of Florence, a formal assignment from the Medici to write the official history of the city, which came in 1520, and which represented the closest thing to a real job that Machiavelli had held since 1512. It was not the job he wanted. He wanted to be back in the Chancery, back in the room where the decisions were made, back in the work of practical administration and diplomacy that he had spent 14 years mastering. The history of Florence was an honourable commission, and he took it seriously, and produced a work of genuine quality. But it was the work of a man who is being kept at a distance from the centre, while being given enough to do that the distance can be maintained without obvious cruelty. He worked on the history from 1520 through 1525. Years during which he also wrote The Art of War, a dialogue on military organization that drew on everything he had learned from his militia experience and from his years of watching professional armies operate. The Art of War was published in 1521, making it the only major work Machiavelli saw in print during his lifetime. It was received well enough to give him some grounds for optimism. It demonstrated his continued usefulness, his continued engagement with the problems that mattered to the people who held power. It was evidence that he was not a man of the past. He was also, during these same years, travelling again on behalf of the Florentine government, in a limited capacity that fell considerably short of the diplomatic role he had held before, but that kept him in the network of contacts and information that had always been his primary professional resource. He was sent to Lucca in 1520 to settle a commercial dispute. He was sent to the Franciscan friars in Carpi in 1521. The mission he described to Guicciardini with such dry amusement. Each assignment was a small measure of how much the government trusted him, which was never as much as he wanted and always enough to keep him engaged. The history of Florence was completed in 1525 and presented to Pope Clement VII, who was a Medici, born Giulio de' Medici, and who had been governing Florence through proxies since 1523. The reception was polite and the payment was adequate. Machiavelli was in his mid-50s by this point, and the 15 years since his dismissal had marked him in the way that sustained uncertainty marks people, not by breaking them, but by adjusting their baseline, shifting the register in which they operate from confidence to endurance. He was also watching Italy deteriorate in the way he had spent his career trying to warn against. The foreign powers that had been carving up the peninsula since 1494 were still there, still fighting, still treating Italian territory as a battlefield and Italian people as incidental to the conflicts being conducted on their land. The Italian states were too divided, too dependent on foreign backing, too committed to short-term tactical manoeuvring at the expense of the strategic solidarity that might have made them collectively capable of defending themselves. He could see what was coming with the clarity that came from having watched the same mechanics operate for 30 years, and he could not stop it. He had only his pen and his desk, and the diminishing circle of men who still read what he wrote and took it seriously. In 1527, everything broke at once. In May of 1527, the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, unpaid and hungry, and moving through Italy without effective opposition, descended on Rome. By many contemporary accounts, the sack that followed was among the most violent events in the city's long history. Churches and palaces and libraries were stripped of their contents. Cardinals were held for ransom. Pope Clement VII was besieged in the Castel Sant'Angelo while his city was taken apart around him. The event left an imprint on European memory that would last for generations. The political consequences in Florence were immediate. The Medici, whose position depended on their connection to the papacy, and who were identified in Florentine eyes with the foreign powers that had produced the catastrophe, were driven from the city for the second time. The Republic was restored. A new government was formed, and Florentines who had spent years under Medici rule moved quickly to establish the institutions that the restoration required. Machiavelli had spent 15 years carefully managing his relationship with the Medici government, demonstrating his usefulness, seeking the appointment that never came, staying close enough to the centre to remain relevant without getting close enough to become fully implicated in decisions that were increasingly hard to defend. He had walked a line that required constant attention and produced constant anxiety, and delivered, in the end, the History of Florence Commission and a series of minor assignments, and nothing more substantial than that. And now the government he had been trying to work for was gone. And the government that replaced it was the kind of government he had spent his entire career believing in. He applied immediately for his old position as Second Chancellor. The timing seemed perfect. The Republic was back. He was the most experienced Republican administrator in Florence. He had spent 14 years in the position before his dismissal. He understood the Chancery better than anyone alive. If there was ever a moment when the path back was open, this was it. The new government refused him. The reasoning, as it filtered through the political conversations of the time, was exactly the reverse of the reasoning that had kept him out of the Medici government. The Medici had not trusted him because he had served the Republic. The Republic did not trust him because he had spent 15 years trying to serve the Medici. He had been sufficiently useful to the Medici to be associated with them in the eyes of their opponents, and sufficiently associated with the Republic to never be fully trusted by the Medici themselves. He had spent 15 years navigating between two governments and had succeeded in making himself suspect to both. The irony was not lost on him. He had written extensively about the specific dangers of the middle position, the position of the man who tries to please everyone and ends up committing fully to no one, and had analysed with considerable precision the ways in which that position tends to produce exactly the outcome it is designed to avoid. He had been living that analysis for 15 years. He had known the risks. He had taken them anyway, because the alternative was either complete commitment to a Medici government he fundamentally disagreed with, or complete withdrawal from political life that his nature made impossible. There was no good option. There had never been a good option. There was only the situation, and the situation had caught him. His health was already declining in the spring of 1527. The exact nature of his illness is not specified in detail in the surviving records, but the accounts suggest a deterioration that had been building for some time, and that the rejection by the new Republican government accelerated, not as a metaphor, but as a physical reality, the way that sustained disappointment can move through a body that has been under stress for a long time. He died on the 21st of June, 1527, 6 weeks after the sack of Rome, and a few weeks after the Republican government's refusal of his application. He was in his late 50s. He had been born in the Florence of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and had watched the city transform itself 4 times across the span of a single life. From Medici Principality to Republic, to Savonarolan theocracy, to Republic again, to Medici rule again, and back to Republic once more. And in all of those transformations he had tried, with every resource he had, to be useful to the city he loved. He was buried in Santa Croce, the great Franciscan church in Florence, where many of the city's most distinguished citizens were laid to rest. His family was present. A small number of friends came. There was no state funeral, no official recognition, no public acknowledgement of the 14 years he had spent in the service of the Republic, or the works he had written during the 15 years of his exile. He died without knowing that the Prince would be published 3 years after his death. In 1530, he died without knowing that the discourses would follow, and the history of Florence, and the art of war, and the Mandragola. He died without knowing that within a generation his name would be known across Europe, and that within a century it would be known across the world, and that within 5 centuries it would be one of the most immediately recognizable names in the history of political thought. He died knowing that he had not gotten his job back. A monument to him stands in Santa Croce, erected in 1787, 2.5 centuries after his death, carrying an inscription that has become one of the most quoted epitaphs in the Italian language. It reads, in translation, that no praise is adequate for so great a name. He would have found the timing of the tribute entirely consistent with everything he had ever written about the relationship between merit and reward. He had spent his entire life being proved right, just slightly too late for the proof to matter. The books remained, and what the world decided to do with those books was not at all what he had written them to do. Chapter 9. 5 Centuries of Misreading. A book becomes a symbol, and once it becomes a symbol, the symbol is almost impossible to displace, because the symbol is more useful than the book. The symbol can be applied quickly. Without the patience that reading requires, the symbol can carry exactly the meaning its user needs it to carry. The symbol can be deployed in a sentence where the book would require a paragraph, and a paragraph where the book would require an afternoon. This is what happened to The Prince within a generation of its publication, and the process by which it happened tells us as much about the 5 centuries that followed Machiavelli as it does about the man himself. The Prince was published in 1530. 3 years after Machiavelli's death, it circulated, was read, was discussed, and in 1559 was placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Catholic Church's list of forbidden books, under Pope Paul IV. Formally banning a book in 16th century Europe was, as it has always been, one of the most reliable ways to guarantee that everyone with access to a printing press would produce a copy of it. And the prohibition did exactly what prohibitions of interesting books always do. It ensured that The Prince was read by virtually every educated person in Europe within a generation, and that it was read with the specific, heightened attention that forbidden things always attract. But the reading was shaped from the beginning by an interpretation that had very little to do with the text and a great deal to do with the political anxieties of the moment. Picture Paris in 1576. 4 years have passed since the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in which thousands of French Protestants were killed in a coordinated campaign of violence organized in part by members of the French court. The blood is still in the memory of everyone who survived it. The Protestant community needs a story that makes the suffering make sense. It needs a name for what was done to them. It needs a face. A French Huguenot lawyer named Innocent Gentilet gives them one. Gentilet publishes a work called The Discourse Against Machiavelli, known in its time as the Anti-Machiavel. His argument is that the massacre was the product of Machiavellian political philosophy imported from Italy by the Medici, specifically by Catherine de' Medici, the Italian-born Queen Mother, widely believed by French Protestants to have played a central role in organizing the killings. He constructs an image of Machiavelli as the philosopher of statecraft without morality, the man who taught Italian rulers that murder and deception were legitimate political tools, and whose influence has now spread north of the Alps with catastrophic results. The argument is not careful scholarship. Gentilet's readings of Machiavelli are consistently selective, consistently distorted, and consistently designed to produce a conclusion he reached before he opened the book. He is not trying to understand Machiavelli. He is trying to explain a massacre. and Machiavelli is a useful explanation. But the argument is enormously effective, because it gives people what traumatized people always need: a story that makes the suffering make sense. It gives Protestant Europe a villain with a specific name and a specific text and a specific national origin. The Machiavelli that Gentile constructs, the cold, cynical Italian who taught princes to lie and murder without scruple, becomes the Machiavelli that English playwrights put on stage, the Machiavelli that German theologians warn against, the Machiavelli that everyone who wants a symbol for unprincipled power politics can reach for without having to engage with the actual text. Christopher Marlowe puts a character called Machiavel on stage in the prologue to his play The Jew of Malta around 1590, a figure who speaks admiringly of his own amorality and announces that religion is a childish toy and that there is no sin but ignorance. This figure has nothing to do with the man who wrote the exhortation at the end of The Prince, the man who believed in citizen soldiers and republican institutions and the liberation of Italy, but it is compelling theatre. And compelling theatre is often more durable than accurate history. Shakespeare draws on the same tradition. Richard III is explicitly described in Henry VI Part 3 as having read the murderous Machiavel to school. The association between Machiavelli and theatrical villainy becomes so embedded in English cultural memory that it survives long after the original political anxieties that produced it have faded. The pattern that follows across the next 3 centuries is consistent and worth naming directly. The rulers who invoked Machiavelli most loudly tended to read him most selectively, taking the parts that justified what they already wanted to do and leaving aside the parts that complicated it. Frederick the Great of Prussia wrote an anti-Machiavel when he was crown prince, a refutation of Machiavelli's ideas published in 1740 with Voltaire's assistance, arguing that the good king governs through virtue and justice and has no need for the cynical calculations of the prince. There is a detail about Frederick that his official portrait does not capture, but that his private correspondence does. He was 28 years old when he finished the Anti-Machiavel, writing from a palace where his primary concern was survival under a father who had once threatened to execute him. He genuinely believed the arguments he was making. He had simply never yet governed anything. Frederick became king in 1740 and spent the following decades pursuing foreign policy objectives with a strategic realism that historians, including Tim Blanning in his biography of the Prussian king, have noted bore considerably more resemblance to the analytical approach of the prince than to the idealistic arguments of his own refutation. The experience of actual power had educated him in the way that actual power always educates people who are paying attention. Napoleon is reported to have read the prince carefully and found the analysis useful. Whether every specific account of his engagement with the text is accurate is a matter of historical debate. But the broader claim is consistent with everything we know about how Napoleon prepared himself for leadership. He was, in many respects, the kind of new prince that the prince describes. A man of exceptional ability who came to power through a combination of military genius and political opportunity, and who built a position that was structurally dependent on his personal capacity to maintain it. He was also, in the end, brought down by the dependency on fortune that no amount of virtue can entirely overcome. Mussolini wrote admiringly about Machiavelli and tried to claim him for fascist politics, presenting himself as the fulfillment of the Machiavellian vision, the strong leader who would finally restore Italy to greatness. What he actually took from Machiavelli was selective and self-serving. as it has always been with leaders who invoke the name. He ended in a way that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately as the predictable consequence of the specific errors the prince warns against most clearly. Having become so dependent on a single foreign ally that when that ally's position collapsed, his own collapsed with it. The 20th century academic rehabilitation of Machiavelli came from several directions and produced a more honest and more complicated picture than the centuries of theatrical villainy had allowed. Isaiah Berlin, in a famous essay published in 1972 called The Originality of Machiavelli, argued that what made Machiavelli genuinely original was not his cynicism, but his implicit recognition that there are two irreducibly different systems of values in the world. The Christian moral system, which prizes humility, charity, and the salvation of the individual soul, and the classical civic system, which prizes strength, civic virtue, and the survival and greatness of the political community. Machiavelli did not reject the Christian system. He recognized that it was incompatible with the demands of political life as he had observed it, and he chose to write about political life honestly rather than pretending the incompatibility did not exist. Berlin argued that this recognition was more philosophically honest than the Christian humanism that condemned him. Quentin Skinner, in his 1981 book Machiavelli, published in the Past Masters series, placed the works carefully in their historical and intellectual context, and argued that Machiavelli was working within a recognizable tradition of humanist thought, while simultaneously transforming it in specific and important ways. The transformation was not the abandonment of ethics, but the insistence that political ethics had to be grounded in a realistic account of political life rather than an idealized one. What emerges from the scholarly rehabilitation is a picture that is more interesting than either the theatrical villain or the misunderstood genius. Machiavelli was a man of his time who was also ahead of his time, working with the intellectual tools available to a Florentine humanist of the early 16th century, while asking questions that those tools were not designed to answer. His answers were sometimes brilliant, sometimes incomplete, always seriously intended, and almost never what his critics claimed they were. The Machiavelli who has terrified and fascinated readers for 5 centuries is mostly Gentilette's invention. The man who wrote the letters to Vettori, the man who built the militia, the man who sat at the desk in Sant'Andrea, dressed in his finest clothes, talking to the ancient dead, is considerably more human, considerably more sympathetic, and considerably more interesting. He deserves to be read, not in the selective way that politicians and playwrights have always read him, mining the text for the phrases that confirm what they already believe, in the complete way, from the dedication to the exhortation, with the context and the career and the torture and the exile and the laughter and the failed job applications all held in mind. That reading produces a different man than the one the centuries of misreading have given us, and the different man is the real one. Chapter 10. What Machiavelli actually got right. Serious ideas have to pass a test, and it is not the test of whether the people who hold them are pleasant or morally admirable or politically successful. It is the test of whether the ideas help explain things that other ideas fail to explain, whether the framework they provide illuminates patterns that would otherwise remain invisible, whether the questions they ask are the right questions even when the answers are incomplete or wrong. Machiavelli's ideas pass this test. Not all of them, and not without qualification. but sufficiently and in sufficiently important domains that the case for taking him seriously as a thinker, rather than simply as a historical curiosity or a symbol of political cynicism, is strong. The most important thing Machiavelli got right is something so fundamental that it is easy to miss, precisely because it has become foundational to how we think about politics at all. He insisted that political analysis must begin with the world as it is, rather than the world as it should be. This seems obvious now. It was not obvious in 1513. The dominant tradition of political thought available to a Florentine humanist in the early 16th century was organized around the question of what a good ruler should be, and the answers it produced were full of recommendations about virtue and wisdom and justice that bore no relationship to the actual behavior of actual rulers in actual situations. Machiavelli looked at those recommendations and asked a simple question that no one in the tradition had asked with sufficient directness. What happens to a ruler who follows these recommendations in a world where the other rulers are not following them? The answer, which his 14 years of observation had given him in considerable empirical detail, was that such a ruler gets destroyed, not because virtue is bad, but because unilateral virtue in a world of mixed motivations is a form of strategic blindness. This is the foundational insight of what we now call political realism. The approach to international relations and domestic politics that begins with the recognition that political actors pursue interests, that the pursuit of interests sometimes produces conflict, and that the analysis of politics must account for this reality rather than assuming it away. Hans Morgenthau, the German-American scholar whose work Politics Among Nations, published in 1948, helped establish the serious academic study of international relations, acknowledged Machiavelli as part of the longer realist tradition he was working within, not as a direct inheritance in every case, but as a foundational voice in the ongoing conversation about how power actually operates in the world. His analysis of political institutions is equally durable. The argument in the discourses that republics are superior to principalities, not because republicans are better people, but because republican institutions distribute risk and create incentives that align individual and collective interests more reliably than any alternative, is an argument that subsequent history has supported with considerable consistency. His insight that you cannot rely on good men to produce good outcomes and must therefore design systems that produce adequate outcomes even with ordinary men as their material remains one of the most honest foundations for thinking about governance that political thought has produced. His understanding of reputation as a form of power, the argument that the perception of strength and consistency are themselves political resources, independent of the actual resources a leader commands, is borne out by every serious study of political leadership from Machiavelli's time to the present. He was articulating this insight in 1513 before the fields that would eventually validate it existed. His analysis of institutional decay deserves particular attention, because it speaks with unusual directness to questions that feel very much alive in the present moment. He argued in the discourses that republics do not fail suddenly. They fail gradually, through the accumulation of small corruptions, small departures from the founding principles, small moments when personal interest is allowed to override civic duty. Each individual departure seems minor. The cumulative effect is the slow hollowing out of the institution until it retains the form of a republic while losing the substance. He called this process corruption, and he believed it was the primary danger that republics faced. Not dramatic external conquest, but the quiet internal erosion that happens when citizens stop believing that the institutions are worth defending. He also argued, and this is the part that is most uncomfortable for those who believe in the natural resilience of democratic systems, that the erosion is self-reinforcing. Once a significant portion of the population comes to believe that the institutions are corrupt and therefore not worth respecting, their disrespect accelerates the corruption, which accelerates the disrespect, in a cycle that is very difficult to interrupt once it gains momentum. The cure he prescribed was what he called in the discourses the renewal of republics, a deliberate and sometimes painful reassertion of the values that the institution was built to serve. Robert Putnam, the Harvard political scientist whose paper Bowling Alone was first published in 1995 and expanded into a full book in 2000, documented the decline of civic engagement and social capital in the United States, beginning roughly in the 1960s. His analysis of how participation in civic institutions had declined over decades, and how that decline had eroded the social trust that democratic governance depends on, was working within a tradition of thinking about republican self-governance that Machiavelli helped establish, even when that tradition was not explicitly invoked. 5 centuries of later history suggest that Machiavelli identified a mechanism, a way that institutions fail, that is not specific to any era or any country. The mechanism operates the same way regardless of when or where it is found, and recognizing the mechanism is the first step toward doing something about it, which is why understanding Machiavelli honestly is not merely a historical exercise, it is a practical one. Now for the other side, because an honest account requires it, and because Machiavelli himself would have insisted on nothing less. He substantially underestimated the role of economic forces in political life. The world he analysed was a world of princes and republics and armies and diplomatic manoeuvres, and he had a sophisticated understanding of the dynamics within that world. But the commercial revolution that was transforming the economic basis of European society in his lifetime, the rise of merchant capitalism, the development of financial instruments and credit systems that were shifting the foundations of political power, these are largely absent from his analysis. He saw the soldier and the prince clearly. He did not see the banker with comparable clarity, and the banker was already changing the world in ways that would eventually make some of the prince's most important decisions dependent on factors Machiavelli's framework did not account for. He was also wrong, or at least seriously incomplete, in his treatment of the role of ideology and deeply held belief in political life. He tended to treat religious conviction as a tool of political management, something that rulers could use to organize popular loyalty, and that the sophisticated prince understood instrumentally rather than sincerely. The Reformation, which was beginning in the same years that Machiavelli was writing, would demonstrate that religious conviction was capable of generating political force that no amount of instrumental management could contain or redirect. The wars of religion that tore Europe apart for the century following his death were not fully explicable within his framework, and his treatment of women and of the social arrangements that governed the lives of half the population he was analysing was, by any honest assessment, inadequate. The women who appear in his work are mostly instruments of political analysis, figures whose situations illuminate the dynamics he is interested in rather than subjects whose own perspectives and interests matter in their own right. This is a limitation of his framework that subsequent political thought has had to supply from other sources. These are real limitations, and they should be stated clearly. The scholar who acknowledges what Machiavelli got wrong is doing more to honour him than the enthusiast who presents him as having anticipated everything correctly. Because Machiavelli himself was always more interested in what was true than in what was flattering. He would have wanted the honest account, and the honest account, carefully examined and fairly given, is more than enough. Chapter 11. The man in the evening clothes. Come back to the desk. Come back to the small farmhouse at Sant'Andrea in Percasina, to the room where a man in his mid-40s sits in the evening light after the day's arguments with woodcutters have ended, dressed in the finest clothes he owns, with the books of the ancient historians open before him, and the candle burning low, and the Tuscan countryside dark and quiet outside the window. The fire is low. The room smells of tallow and old paper, and the particular damp of a farmhouse in winter. His hands are cold. He does not notice. He is somewhere else entirely. He is in the courts of the ancient men, and they are answering his questions. This is where we began. This is where we need to end. Not because it is the most dramatic moment in Machiavelli's life. It is not. The Pazzi Conspiracy was more dramatic. The months at Borgia's court were more dramatic. The torture in the Bargello was more dramatic. But the desk is the right place to end, because it is the place where everything came together, where the 14 years of service and the months of imprisonment and the years of exile produced the thing that has lasted when everything else has gone. The act of changing clothes before sitting down to write has attracted attention from scholars and biographers for centuries. It was not a performance for an imaginary audience, or a ritual of self-consolation. Machiavelli was not a man given to self-consolation or to performances without purpose. He described it in the letter to Vettori because it was true and because it illustrated something he wanted Vettori to understand about the experience of the writing. He was describing a preparation, the dirty clothes of the day, the arguments about timber prices, the card games with the miller and the butcher. These were the surface of the life he was living in exile, the texture of the humiliation that had been imposed on him by the political reversal of 1512. The fine clothes were not a denial of that humiliation. They were a statement that the humiliation did not define what was happening at the desk. When he sat down to write, he was not the dismissed official, the disgraced servant of a defunct republic, the tortured suspect who had endured the strappado and walked out with nothing to show for it but his freedom and his silence. He was the man who had been in the room, who had sat across tables from Borgia and Caterina Sforza and the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, who had spent 14 years watching the mechanics of power operate at close range, and who had understood, in the specific way that only direct, sustained observation produces, how it worked and why it kept failing. He was receiving the ancient men in his finest clothes because the ancient men deserved his best attention, and because the conversation he was having with them was the most important conversation he had ever been part of, more important than any of the diplomatic conversations he had conducted with living princes, because this conversation was not about the specific and temporary problems of Florence in 1513. It was about the permanent problems of political life, the problems that were the same in Republican Rome as in Renaissance Florence, the same in the kingdoms of ancient Greece as in the courts of Renaissance France, the same, as 5 centuries of later history suggest, as they are in every era where human beings organize themselves into communities and have to work out how to govern those communities and distribute power within them. Think about what that desk produced. It produced The Prince, which is still in print in every major language on earth, and is still being read by political scientists and executives and generals and students, and anyone who wants to understand the mechanics of power rather than its mythology. It produced the discourses on Livy, which helped shape the broader Republican tradition that influenced the thinking of the men who designed the American constitutional system, whose argument that institutions must be built to survive the failures of individuals is still the most honest foundation for democratic governance that political thought has produced. It produced the Mandragola, which has been regularly revived and performed across 5 centuries, because it is still funny and still true about the specific ways that human institutions fail the people inside them, and because Fra Timoteo is still recognizable in every institution, in every country, in every year that passes. It produced the History of Florence, which is one of the earliest examples of historical writing that tries to explain events through the analysis of underlying causes rather than simply narrating what happened. All of this came from that desk, from a man who had lost everything, who was living on a farm outside Florence, arguing with labourers about the price of wood, who was trying to get his old job back and failing at it, who had been tortured and dismissed and exiled and refused by every government that had a position to offer. The desk remained when everything else was taken. The work remained when the desk was gone. And the questions the work asks remain now. When the man has been dead for 5 centuries, and the city he loved has been transformed beyond anything he could have imagined, and when the problems he spent his life trying to understand are still the problems that matter most, we asked a question at the beginning of this story, and we have been carrying it through every chapter since. Now, at the end, standing at this desk, in this cold room, with the fire burning low and the ancient men waiting, we can answer it. Can a man who loved his city honestly, who served it faithfully, who saw it clearly, be the person history remembers as a villain? Not in the simple way history made him one. The villain is Gentiezinvention, a story told to explain a massacre, a symbol borrowed from a traumatized community and passed down through centuries of careless repetition until the symbol replaced the man entirely. The symbol was useful. It was also wrong, not in the small ways that historical misunderstandings are usually wrong, but in the large way, the way that erases a person and replaces them with a warning. The real man is the one at the desk. The real man is the one who endured the strappado and said nothing because there was nothing to say, who went home to his farm and put on his finest clothes in the evenings and talked to the dead about the things that mattered, who built a militia and watched it fail and did not stop believing in the idea it was built around, who wrote a book about how power actually works and ended that book with a passionate call for the liberation of the country he loved, who laughed with his friends at the Orti Oracellari and came home to Marietta and the children and loved them in the imperfect, intermittent way that people love their families when they have committed their lives to something that takes almost everything. Did we misread him for 500 years because the truth he was telling was the one we least wanted to hear? Yes, that is exactly what happened. We made him a villain because it was easier than sitting with what he was actually saying, which was that the world works the way it works, and that pretending otherwise does not change it, only makes us less prepared for it. The question is still alive. It is alive every time a democratic institution is asked to defend itself against people who understand how institutions fail better than the people inside them do. It is alive every time someone in power chooses the appearance of virtue over the substance of it. It is alive every time an unarmed prophet builds a following on conviction alone, and then watches the following dissolve when the conviction fails to produce results. Machiavelli did not answer these questions. He asked them with more precision and more honesty than almost anyone before or since, and he asked them from a desk in a farmhouse outside Florence while wearing his finest clothes in the dark, talking to people who had been dead for 2,000 years. A line in the letter to Vittori does not get quoted as often as the famous passage about the ancient courts, but contains, in its simplicity, something as important as anything in the books. After describing the evenings of writing, Machiavelli tells his friend that in the work he is composing, he delves as deeply as he can into the ideas concerning the subject, debating what a principality is, what kinds there are, how they are acquired, how they are maintained, why they are lost, debating, not announcing, not pronouncing, debating. He is in conversation with the ancient historians, with his own experience, with the questions that the experience raised and that the historians helped him think through. He is not delivering a doctrine. He is working something out, and the work is not finished, and the work may never be finished, because the questions are not the kind that reach a final answer. This is the Machiavelli that the centuries of misreading have most consistently failed to see. The man at the desk is not the cold-eyed architect of political cynicism. He is a thinker in genuine conversation with genuine problems, bringing to those problems everything he had learned through 14 years of watching the world at close range and 15 years of thinking carefully about what he had seen. He was wrong about some things. He was right about others. And the things he was right about are still right, still useful, still illuminating aspects of political life that are otherwise difficult to see clearly. He was not a villain. He was not a saint. He was a man who looked at the world with unusual honesty and wrote down what he saw, and the honesty of the looking and the precision of the writing have kept the work alive long after everything else about his situation. The poverty, the exile, the failed job applications, the torture, the dismissed militia, the city that rejected him twice, has receded into history. The candle at the desk went out a long time ago. The questions it illuminated are still burning. Every time someone asks whether the leader they are watching is telling them the truth or performing truth, every time someone wonders whether the institution they are part of is designed to serve the people inside it or to serve itself, every time someone tries to hold the gap between how power is supposed to work and how it actually works in a single clear view, without flinching and without pretending the gap is smaller than it is. In all of those moments, Machiavelli is at the desk, dressed in his finest clothes, receiving the ancient men kindly, feeding on the food that is his alone, still debating, still working it out, still asking what a principality is, how it is acquired, how it is maintained, and why it is lost. Settle into that question with him. It is, as he spent his entire life demonstrating, entirely worth the time. Good night, and thank you for staying until the end.